Thank you, Tina. Good morning, everyone. My name's Stuart Green. I'm one of the security engineers working for Checkpoint in the UK. And today we're going to be having a look at one of our newer products in the portfolio, Dome9. So Dome9 was a product that Checkpoint acquired in the tail end of 2018, and its main purpose is to give you a level of visibility and control of your public cloud assets that you might be missing if you were just using some of the native tools. I'm sure a lot of you follow the news and the media, and you're familiar with cases like Capital One, where misconfigurations and oversights in the public cloud have led to quite poor security postures. So one of the things that Dome9 hopes to give you is that extra level of visibility. So within the public clouds, within AWS, Azure, GCP, there are a number of tools available to help you secure your assets and your presence in the public cloud, but they can be a little bit difficult to configure. So this is where Dome9 comes in. Now, hopefully you can all see my screen. What you can see here is the main overview of Dome9. When you onboard your public cloud accounts, which could be AWS, Azure, or GCP, Google Cloud Platform, you will get, first and foremost, a visibility into what you've got in your public cloud. A number of the customers that I speak to on a sort of daily basis know that they're using public cloud, but they don't necessarily know what they're doing in particular in public cloud. Because public cloud environments are quite dynamic and prone to change very quickly depending on what projects a company is working on at any particular time, it can be difficult for C-levels and executives and managers to know exactly what their level of exposure or risk is in any given public cloud environment. So the first thing you see when you onboard an account, that is to join it into Dome9, is you get a breakdown of your assets. You get a number of widgets, you get quite an attractive dashboard, and you can see here that we've got a number of Kubernetes pods running, we've got some AWS IAM roles, VPCs, Lambda functions, S3 buckets, instances. This will all vary depending on what customer it is that's using the product. But for a customer that doesn't know what they're doing in public cloud, this can be a real eye-opener. So if, for example, you join in your corporate account to Dome9, you might discover that you've got some developers going off and doing something with Lambda functions that weren't part of the corporate plan, and they might present a risk to the business that you weren't aware of. So from the moment you join your account to Dome9, you start seeing things which you might not necessarily have been aware of. Now, this is all good, but the real power comes from when you start drilling down into the assets that you have in the public cloud. So this isn't one of the most powerful parts of Dome9, but the way Dome9 works is it connects to the APIs, the programmer interfaces of the public cloud platforms. So by doing that, we pull in all of the metadata about all of the services that you're consuming, all of the objects, IP addresses, security groups, ACLs, and we combine that into the Dome9 portal. So because we have access to all of that data, it gives you a really easy interface to search and find particular assets that, let's say, for example, you have a SOC or a NOC team, and they've seen a particular threat from a particular IP address or to a particular IP address. If you're running across AWS, GCP, and Azure, that could take you 30 minutes, could take you an hour, it could take you more to find which particular asset has got that IP address associated with it. So here, let's say the SOC team had a hit for an IP address on an FTP server. All you would have to do is type in the name of the asset. In our case, it's FTP, and that will take you straight to that instance, that object. From there, you can drill down into it, and you can see any alerts that have been generated as part of that object, or you can see any security groups that were applied, or any compliance policies that may feature that asset. Compliance we'll get onto shortly. But from here, you can see what availability zone it's in, what IP address is associated with it, what region it's in, and more importantly, you can see and control the security groups that are applied to it. So Dome9 isn't just a tool for monitoring and viewing your security groups and your security posture in public cloud. It allows you to control it as well. Now, that can be as simple as finding the security group that is causing the problem or not causing the problem, clicking on it, editing it, adding in an IP address, adding a port, or you can bake that into a more complex action if you want to. Again, we'll get onto that when we move on to the compliance side of things. But for a day-to-day administrative point of view, having this type of access with Dome9 is really useful, and it saves cloud architects, cloud engineers, cloud admins, whatever their role is in your business, it saves them from having to log into 1, 2, or 3 separate portals to find quite basic information. What we've got here is a combination of, let's say we're looking at AWS, it's a combination of VPC, EC2, security groups, maybe even IAM roles as well. So having all of this information aggregated in one place is a really useful and powerful tool. The majority of interest around Dome9 comes from our compliance, or what we've recently renamed to be posture management. So if you're operating in public cloud and you're in the UK, there's a good chance that you have come across GDPR at some point. Now, it's a bit of a misconception to say that the cloud provider will take care of all of that for you and all you've got to do is pay them and they'll look after it. That very much is not the case at all. If you're operating in any of the public cloud environments, that is an extension of your physical or your on-premises network. So you are just as much responsible for looking after GDPR or any of the other policies that you might be obliged to comply with. They are your responsibility. You are just using that public cloud environment for an extension of your workloads. Fortunately, Dome9 gives you a very easy method of checking for compliance against those particular frameworks. Now, that's not to say that if you buy Dome9 and you start using it, it's going to automatically make you GDPR compliant. It's not a framework that works in that way. But what it does give you is a number of predefined rules that have been put together by our compliance experts to check against any of the assets that you've got deployed in the public cloud and make sure they're configured as best as they possibly can be. So once you've got your accounts linked in, it might be one, it might be two, it might be three public cloud accounts across each of the different providers. If you want to say, I want to see how well I am, how compliant I am towards something like GDPR. I literally search for GDPR, find the one that is relevant to my environment. So in this case, I'm going to check it against AWS. I'm going to run the test, choose what region I'm going to run it in. You can break it down if you've got a large team and you've got different areas that are responsible for different regions, then you can say, I'm responsible for Europe. I'm only going to look at the European region, or you can run it against all of them. It's equally as easy. So in this particular one, I'm going to run against Ireland because I know roughly what to expect. I will click run, and what that's doing in the background is that's using the API between Dome9 and AWS to interrogate all of the assets that you've got configured in that particular account or in that particular region, and it's going to assess them against a framework that Checkpoint manage to say whether or not we think this meets the GDPR requirements for that particular configuration element. So once that runs, it's generally fairly quick. It depends on how many assets you've got deployed and how many regions we're hitting. Normally within about 30 seconds to a minute, you'll get your report back. So what we've got here is a real-time snapshot of how compliant we are or how ready we are for a GDPR type audit. And you can see here we've got a number of entities which have failed with high and medium severity risks associated with them. If you scroll down and drill down into the test, you can see each of the specific reasons of why that asset has failed. So some of them are quite complex, some of them are quite simple. So we can see here, we've got S3 buckets which do not have SSL enabled. That's a relatively easy fix. You would go into the bucket and you would enable SSL to make sure that you've got transport encryption enabled. If you're working with an auditor at this point, you've also got a reference back to the particular article of the framework that you're assessing against, which makes life easier for them and it makes things easier to document as well. In terms of documentation, GDPR is something which you're not necessarily going to be compliant with straight off the bat. If you are, well done, but most companies have a bit more work to do to make sure they're getting as high a mark as they possibly can with regards to complying to that framework. So for that reason, we have an assessment history. So if someone comes in as a proactive action or something's happened and you're having to provide your documentation to an assessor, you can say, well, we started here on our journey to public cloud and we were 40% compliant, but over time, over weeks or months, we've built that up and we've gradually become more and more compliant. So we've moved up to 70, 80, 90, 95% compliance, and you've got that documentation trail to prove to them. All of that has been generated automatically. It's not something you have to enable manually. Anytime you run an assessment against your public cloud assets, that will be added to the assessment history. Now, with the compliance, it's all well and good running something in an ad hoc basis, but everyone knows if you run a report, there's a good chance that minutes, hours, days after that, someone's going to go in and someone's going to change something. Let's say, for example, you've worked really hard and you've run this test and everything is compliant. That's not going to pick up on somebody logging in to AWS or Azure the day after you've run that test and then they run a compute workload or a storage instance that's outside of the EU, therefore not necessarily compliant with GDPR. What we have in that instance is the idea of continuous compliance. So instead of running one of these reports in an ad hoc basis, logging in once a month and running a report, checking everything's good, and then going on with your daily life, looking at other things, Dome9 will monitor continually for any compliance policies that you have set up. So it might be GDPR, it might be ISO 27001, it might be PCI. Any checks that you've configured for any of your public cloud environments will be continuously monitored. So every 5 or 10 minutes, it will run the compliance check and it will notify you of anything that might be posing risk to that particular check. It might be something like a managed framework, or it might be a bespoke policy that you've put together that's relevant to your business. So if anything is noticed, it will send you a notification. That notification can be a simple email, or if you want it to be a little bit more advanced and you want to integrate it with something else, it could be an API call out that logs a ticket into your SOC help desk. It could be in ServiceNow, it could be something like a Slack notification or logging a ticket in Jira. Essentially, it's an API call. So if you want to integrate this with anything that you're using that has an API that accepts incoming calls from a third-party product, you can do that. The documentation is very good. We've got a number of API examples, so it's not a complex API. It's all REST-based, it's all web-driven. So integrating Dome9 with another product or integrating another product into Dome9 is very easy to do. For a number of common applications like ServiceNow, Jira, PagerDuty, Slack, we've got built-in notifications for that, and it's a case of ticking the box, providing the right details, and then you can receive your notifications into said third-party application. Now, that's kind of taking the compliance policies and the notifications a step further. If you want to take things even further, you can link that into what we call automatic remediation. So you have your compliance policy running, that runs every 5, 10, 15 minutes, whatever your interval is, and it will check for all of these things and make sure you are continually compliant. If it finds something, rather than saying, I'm going to log a ticket for somebody to manually log in when they've got to their position in the queue, they've worked through their help desk cases, rather than them fixing it manually, you can define a set of actions which will be taken automatically. So let's say, for example, we find a user has deployed an S3 bucket into a disallowed location, let's say outside of the EU, an S3 bucket being a storage facility within AWS. If we find that that's been deployed into a region that we don't permit as part of our business policy, we can take an automatic action to fix that. So we don't have to log a ticket. We don't have to have a human react to that and fix it manually. We can take that action and then just drop an email into the help desk and say, we found something bad, don't worry about it, we've fixed it, carry on with business. That action is typically what we call a cloud bot, which is an open source Python script. It doesn't have to be Python, that's just what we provide. And what happens is Dome9 runs the compliance policy, notices something is wrong, triggers this script, that script will go off and fix something, and then it will send another notification to say all is done, or it requires further investigation. We've got a number of these published. They're all on GitHub, they're all open source. If you want to take those as a basis to build your own automatic remedial actions, you can do that. If you want any assistance with kind of looking at something a bit more bespoke, then that's something you can get in touch with us and we'll be able to assist with. So very easily, Dome9 allows you to go from not having any visibility of your public cloud to getting visibility, getting compliance control over that, and then enforcing that automatically. So it's no longer a black box. You haven't got a cloud team or a DevOps team going off and doing these mysterious cloud things. You can get full visibility of that and automatic control over what they're allowed to do as well. There are some more complex integrations with Dome9 as well. So everything that you see in the web interface is obviously available to kind of consume with the keyboard and mouse, and you can click around and generate reports the old-fashioned way. But there's also an API. Everything in the web interface is built on top of an API. So if you wanted to use the compliance policy as part of a DevOps tool chain, if you're using some sort of CI/CD approach in your environment, you can integrate Dome9 as part of that as well. So if you've developed a business policy that says, I only want to allow cloud things to happen within a particular region, anything outside of that is not allowed, you could set up Dome9 to pre-check anything that gets pushed out to public cloud in terms of infrastructure, and if it doesn't look like it's going to be in a compliant region, you can block that action from happening. So that gets pushed back to the developer or the architect, whoever's working on it, and it will say to them, sorry, part of your configuration says you're deploying to a disallowed region. You're not allowed to proceed past this point until you've addressed that and you fix that particular issue. So it gives you that automated check to stop developers from accidentally or deliberately deploying assets with invalid configurations that are going to pose a risk. So it gives you that level of security and compliance and visibility before it gets pushed out to public cloud and before it poses a risk. That's probably the most powerful part of Dome9. Now, there are other features as well, which are equally as useful, which we'll have a look at next. And the next part is something a little bit more familiar feeling, which is a module we call Clarity. This gives you visibility of your level of exposure to the internet. So once you've had your developers go off and they've deployed a number of assets into public cloud, it's not necessarily easy, or as easy as it is in kind of traditional on-premises networks, to get visibility of what is happening in your public cloud. So Clarity gives you a very easy to use tool to see what your level of exposure is in terms of public IPs and access to the instances that are in public cloud. So what it gives you, again, is real time, it's all API driven. What it gives you is a network diagram of sorts that represents the level of exposure of particular security groups and assets within the public cloud. So what you can see here is we've got a view of one of our virtual private networks within AWS, and it's broken down into 5 swim lanes. So on the left-hand side, you've got these objects which represent things on the internet or named IP addresses or groups or subnets that we've defined either in Dome9, in a security group, or in the public cloud platform itself. So it's something that we've pulled in from a security group that is essentially on the internet. The next column in represents the DMZ objects. So these are objects which have a public IP address and are open on one or more port to the entire internet. Now, if you've got a web presence and you're using public cloud, it's entirely reasonable to have a load balancer, a web server, maybe even a storage facility open to the entire internet on one or more ports, typically 80 or 443, depending on what you're presenting. The next column in is partially open. So these are things which are open to the internet, but have been tied down to one or more IP addresses. So those IP addresses might be, the general internet, but on a set amount of ports, or for a particular partner office or a particular part of a distributed application. It's things which are open, but not completely open. The next column in, this is effectively internal. So these are things which have been deployed on the private side of your public cloud network, say your LAN network or your LAN subnet, but they don't have sufficient security groups applied to them to prevent accidental access. One of the things that you might find if you've been working with public cloud is it's incredibly easy to make something available on the internet. In Azure and in AWS, it can be as simple as a couple of clicks to associate a public IP to something. That IP might not be secured, and before you know it, your test server is available to everyone on the internet. What the objects in this particular column are trying to highlight are they're a good candidate for further hardening. So yes, they are secured by default or by accident at the moment. That doesn't mean that they're not a good candidate for further hardening somewhere down the line. The internal zone, these are things which are well secured and are on the inside of your network in the public cloud. So they have been well secured and they're not a concern for the time being. When you click on any of these security groups, you can see, hopefully you can see it on my screen well enough, you can see certain flow lines appear. So the orange will show you what has access to that particular group, and the blue are what it has access to. So if you're trying to demonstrate somebody the result of a particular instance in a security group being compromised, you can very easily do that by using this tool. So you could say, I'm concerned about somebody compromising something in the common security group. If they were able to access an instance here and compromise it, they could then pivot and access something on the internal zone of my network, which potentially then opens up more access to other parts of the network. And it will give you a picture of how somebody could move from host to host and security group or zone within your public cloud network. So that's a really useful tool. From here, if there is anything that presents a particular concern, you can see what rules are applied to it, what instances are in it, and then you can link back through to the object and modify the security groups again without having to leave Dome9. So Dome9 very quickly becomes your go-to place for administering security groups, network ACLs, and compliance policies. And from a security perspective, people don't have to stray into the native consoles, which can be difficult. If you're working with it on a day-to-day basis, it's fine. You'll learn how to use it. But particularly when you're talking about multi-cloud environments where you're using one, two, or even all of the major public cloud providers, they've all got slightly different approaches to how to set up security groups or firewalls if you're using GCP, and it could be confusing for engineers. There's a lot to take in. The workflows can be different. When you've got your engineers or your architects using Dome9, the look and feel is familiar. So regardless of which platform they're using behind it, they have one tool to use to configure all of this. So it becomes your central point of configuration, like with Checkpoint Smart Console and Security Management Server if you're a Checkpoint customer already. So that's clarity. One of the newer features of Dome9 is a feature called Logic, and this is our take on Cloud SIEM. So this takes your flow logs, your network logs from AWS, your network watcher logs from Azure. GCP is currently not part of this, but that's coming soon. This allows you to explore your logs in a visual way. Now, if you're a Checkpoint customer already, you might be familiar with our technology called Threat Cloud. Threat Cloud is our global intelligence network, whereby any Checkpoint component, any customer that's using Checkpoint, they effectively become a sensor in a global distributed network of sensors. So let's say, for example, we've got a firewall customer and they see a payload come in. We don't know what the payload is. It doesn't have any intelligence associated with it. We send that to our sandboxing environment. Then we determine that it's a threat. It poses a risk, whatever that risk might be. We generate some intelligence on that and we push it up to Threat Cloud, and then that is shared amongst any other Checkpoint customer globally. So whether they're using another security gateway, if they're using the cloud, if they're using mobile or endpoint, all of that intelligence is shared. So it only takes one customer to observe a particular threat for it to be shared amongst all of the customers globally. That is now extended to Dome9. So traditionally, Dome9 has been a separate product, and then as Checkpoint have brought it on, we've started to integrate more and more of our intelligence into that. And Logic is the first part where we've integrated some of that. So very quickly and very easily, you can run a query that says, I want to look at all of my traffic within the public cloud environment, and I want to highlight where any of that traffic has gone to something which we know to be malicious. So if you take that query, for example, you can very quickly define a policy that says, I want to show any of my hosts which may have been compromised, because in most situations, there aren't many explanations for your host accessing a command and control server apart from it's been compromised, or there's someone attacking it, or there's something running on it which shouldn't be there. So you can run a query that says, show me where the destination is malicious. That malicious will then represent anything like command and control servers, compromised PCs that are part of a botnet, IP addresses which are known to belong to APT threat actors, and as part of that, you can feed it into a compliance policy. So we've already looked at the compliance and the posture management part of Dome9. Based on traffic logs, you could say, if I see any of my hosts accessing something bad, I want to immediately alert a SOC analyst or a NOC engineer, or I want to take an automatic reaction, as we spoke about before, and I want to apply a highly restrictive security group to stop it talking to that destination, and log a help desk ticket in the background for a SOC analyst to look at that host, see if it's compromised, if it has been compromised, rebuild it, redeploy it, whatever the action might be. Now, one of the newer functionalities of Dome9 is we now have support for Kubernetes workloads. So we can see what is happening with regards to compliance within your Kubernetes to make sure you're not running vulnerable configurations. But on top of that, you can also map the communication between the different components of your Kubernetes environment. So if I go here and roll this back a bit, you can start to build very intelligent compliance and automation policies based on Kubernetes workloads. So if you've got a microservices architecture, this one's not very micro because there's quite a lot of components to it, but if you've got an architecture where you've got well-defined traffic patterns, let's say, for example, you've got 4 components, A, B, C, and D. A talks to B, B to C, and C to D. You can define compliance or posture rules for that say, if any communication occurs outside of that predefined pattern, I want to know about it. So this, again, might represent a compromise of a particular component within your architecture. So if B starts talking to D without talking to C, you can say, this is an anomaly. I want to raise an incident based on that. or I want to take an automatic reaction and I want to put a security group on that says block that communication or stop that instance, redeploy it. Whatever the action is, that is entirely your choice. You can take something very hands-off and log a help desk ticket, or if you've got a well-defined response to that type of behavior or potential threat, you can have that applied automatically. The choice is yours. But logic gives you that visibility of it, and also a visualization of that traffic pattern. So it's not just network traffic that logic focuses on. It can also give you visibility into your application interaction within AWS. So if you're familiar with CloudTrail within AWS, this takes in all of your CloudTrail, your API interactions, I guess, between different components of public cloud. So if you wanted to map what your applications were doing, not at a network level, but let's say if you wanted to see which of your applications were reading from a storage facility in AWS, you could map that and you could visualize that within Logic as well. So it's a very powerful tool for getting a visual representation of what's happening within your public cloud environment as far as interactions are concerned. If you've had to deal with raw logs in AWS or many other products, you'll know that they're quite unintelligible, long lines of text, and they're not that easy to digest. So Logic gives you a cloud native way of processing that information and generating intelligence around that, which you can then feed into the compliance engine and the automatic remediation engine. It can also feed into an existing SIEM product or a SIEM solution as well, which could be cloud, it could be on-prem. It doesn't matter. We have the facility to export that via API calls or via common log exporting formats. And we can also take in intelligence from third parties as well. So again, going back to the API integrations with Dome9, if you've got something like an on-premises SIEM and you want to send a trigger into Dome9 to trigger a compliance check, you can do that. If you've got an external vulnerability scanning service and you want to, as the result of an external vulnerability scan, trigger something in Dome9 to check that you don't have any ports open within your public cloud environment, for example, you can do that. And you can start to build really complex solutions with a lot of automation built around them. So your public cloud eventually looks after itself, calls in all of your external tools, and then logs and reports everything back to either a help desk or a SIEM solution if you want it to be. If you don't want it to be that complex, you can turn it on, you can choose what logs you want to see, and then you can get these reports delivered to you automatically. The choice is yours. So there's a couple of other things here. You might have noticed that the serverless section on the left, that's only here as a work in progress. That's very much early availability at the moment, but Dome9 is shortly going to get the functionality to look into your serverless or function as a service features within public cloud, which is your pieces of code that you would upload and that would run a very particular function for a very small amount of time. There was an acquisition last year of a company called Protego. That's, as I say, very much work in progress. I don't have a lot that I can show you on that at the moment, so we'll probably save that for a later date in another session. But if you've got any questions around that in the meantime, do feel free to let me know. For now, I think that's probably all we've got to show on Dome9. There are some other features in there that are a little bit more niche around dynamic access to security groups, IAM safety, which is specific to AWS, some of the API interactions as well. It's a little bit too heavy for today, but all of those I'm happy to talk to anyone about. If any questions come up in the future, just let myself or the guys at Sapphire know, and we'll be happy to help out and